The storm was tearing the remaining shingles from the roof of the abandoned homestead. Silas stood in the rotting doorway, the heavy rifle raised against his broad shoulder. He did not expect intruders in the high pass. The decaying timber of the floor groaned loudly under the violent wind. A massive shadow moved in the dark corner of the ruined parlor. It was a dark shape far too large for an ordinary man. The wind screamed through the broken glass of the windows, throwing sharp ice across the damp floorboards. Silas tightened his massive grip on the walnut stock of the weapon. "Step into the light," he commanded. The voice of Silas was a low, heavy rumble, vibrating beneath the violent crash of the thunder. The shadow shifted. A heavy leather boot, thick and heavily coated in dried mud, slid forward into the dim light. Then came shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. Silas braced his incredibly massive frame for a brutal fight to the death. But the truth waiting in that cold darkness was far more complicated than anyone ever imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The giant figure in the shadows did not raise a weapon. The enormous silhouette swayed, completely exhausted by the punishing elements of the mountain. Then, the massive frame collapsed forward. The body struck the floorboards with a heavy, resonating thud that violently shook the thick dust from the ruined ceiling. Silas lowered the long steel barrel of the rifle. The heart of the stoic mountain man beat with heavy, slow caution. He stepped closer, raising the glass oil lantern in his left hand. The amber light cast long, dancing shapes across the peeling wallpaper of the destroyed room. He stopped beside the fallen giant. He knelt, the thick leather of his boots creaking loudly in the quiet space. With a thick, scarred hand, he gently pushed back the heavy, wet wool of the dark hood. The breath of Silas caught deep in his throat. It was not a desperate outlaw. It was a woman. The sheer physical reality of her defied logic and all expectation. Silas was a man of towering height, standing nearly 7 feet tall. A creature of pure, hardened muscle built by a life of relentless mountain labor. Yet, the woman lying unconscious on the rotting floor rivaled his own imposing, massive size. She was magnificent and terrifying all at once. Her shoulders were incredibly broad, her thick arms wrapped in a tattered canvas work shirt. The torn sleeves exposed heavy forearms, corded with thick, dense muscle. The face of the unknown woman was terribly pale beneath a thick layer of trail dirt and dried mud. Deep, heavy lines of profound exhaustion were etched around her closed eyes. Dark, matted hair clung to her forehead in wet, freezing strands. She was running from something terrible. A woman of this immense, intimidating stature did not simply wander into the dead, frozen peaks of the high country by accident. She had climbed the treacherous mountain pass with desperate intention, seeking a place where no civilized person would ever dare to look. Silas stared down at her in absolute silence. He rubbed the smooth, heavy silver band on his left thumb. It was a quiet node, recurring habit of the giant man whenever deep, troubling thought consumed his mind. He lived entirely alone in the high mountains to escape the cruel, judging world of men. He wanted no part of human suffering. He wanted no part of the relentless complications that followed the tragic lives of others. The brutal isolation was his chosen punishment, and his only peace. Yet, the freezing winter rain continued to pour through the collapsed section of the wooden roof. The heavy, muscular body of the giant woman began to shiver violently against the freezing dampness of the floor. Silas placed the glass lantern on a dry wooden crate. He unbuttoned his massive, heavy deerskin coat. The thick, fur-lined garment held the deep, comforting warmth of his own body. He draped the heavy coat gently over the towering frame of the sleeping woman. He tucked the rough edges carefully around her broad shoulders, ensuring the freezing draft could not reach her chilled skin. She let out a soft, trembling sigh. The fragile sound was surprisingly delicate, coming from a chest so broad and undeniably powerful. Silas moved slowly toward the crumbling stone fireplace. The hearth of the ruined house was filled with old, dry leaves and broken debris. He gathered broken chair legs and splintered floorboards from the surrounding wreckage. With quiet, deliberate movements, he struck a match and sparked a small, crackling fire. He kept the dancing flames low, ensuring the rising smoke would not draw unwanted attention from the distant valley below. He only wanted the fire bright enough to push the bitter, biting cold out of the small corner of the parlor. The sudden warmth radiated across the damp room. The soft golden light touched the dirt-smudged cheeks of the giant sleeping woman. Silas sat back on his heels, resting his massive hands on his knees. He watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing. He had never seen a human creature like her in all his years wandering the lonely frontier. She was a physical marvel, built like a towering fortress of muscle and heavy bone. But the deep, undeniable vulnerability etched into her sleeping features told a harrowing story of profound exhaustion. She was a fierce, resilient warrior who had finally lost the physical strength to fight the wind. The heavy silence of the mountain man was his lifelong armor. For years, Silas had spoken to almost no one. He let the brutal, quiet isolation turn his beating heart into cold, unfeeling stone. But the sudden sight of this magnificent, battered woman cracked something deep within the chest of the solitary giant. It was a dangerous, this forgotten feeling. It was the heavy, terrifying pull of human empathy. He noticed a dark, if heavy bruise blooming across the thick muscle of her exposed bicep. The ugly mark was old, turning a sickly yellow at the frayed edges. Someone had tried to forcefully restrain her. The thought sent a cold, sudden spike of intense anger through the thick blood of Silas. He did not know the true name of the towering woman. He did not know the dark nature of her desperate journey. But the simple, undeniable fact that the world had been cruel enough to drive a woman of this incredible strength to the point of total physical collapse stirred a fierce, wild protective instinct he thought was buried forever in his past. The giant woman shifted again in her troubled sleep. One heavy, calloused hand slid out from beneath the warm deerskin coat. The hand fell onto the dusty floorboards, coming to rest near the heavy leather boot of Silas. He looked down at the thick, bruised knuckles. He reached out slowly into the space between them. He did not touch her skin, respecting the silent boundary of her vulnerable sleep, but he moved his own massive hand to rest just an inch away from hers. The sheer parity of their giant hands resting on the floor was breathtaking. For the first time in a long, dark decade, Silas did not feel completely alone in his overwhelming physical size. The world always viewed him as a monster, a freak of nature, a giant to be feared. Looking at her, then, he realized she likely suffered the exact same cruel judgment. He stood up slowly, his massive head nearly brushing the damaged wooden rafters of the low ceiling. He could not leave her lying on the hard floor of the ruin, but he also knew waking a startled, terrified giant could result in a dangerous, violent panic. He needed to provide absolute safety without forcing a frightening confrontation. Silas stepped backward into the deep shadows of the ruined doorway. He looked one last time at the sleeping giantess, illuminated by the soft, flickering firelight. The winter storm raged outside the broken walls. But inside the ruin, a quiet, fragile sanctuary was slowly forming in the darkness. He turned his broad back and stepped out into the freezing, punishing rain. He had a vital task to complete before the gray dawn broke over the jagged mountains. He had to ensure the trail she left behind in the mud was entirely erased. But as the heavy boots of Silas crunched through the deep, fresh snow, a different sound suddenly pierced the howling wind. It was the sharp, unmistakable snap of a heavy breaking branch, coming directly from the dark tree line, just beyond the property of the ruined ranch. Someone had followed the giant woman up the treacherous mountain, and Silas was entirely out of ammunition. The heavy silence of the mountain shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Silas gripped the cold steel of the empty rifle. He moved through the freezing, driving rain with the terrifying, silent grace of a wild mountain predator. He stepped softly into the deep, black shadows of the ancient pine trees. The broad chest of the giant man heaved with tense anticipation. He expected the sudden, fatal glint of a gun barrel. He expected the cruel, grinning faces of merciless bounty hunters tracking a prized runaway. Instead, a massive bull elk exploded from the thick, snowy brush. The terrified animal crashed heavily through the deep snowdrifts, fleeing the bitter wrath of the howling winter storm. The massive antlers of the beast scraped violently against the frozen bark of the trees as it vanished into the darkness. Silas let out a long, slow breath of pure relief. The pounding, the pip-was violent rhythm in the massive chest of the mountain man slowly faded. He lowered the useless rifle. He looked down at the muddy, chaotic trail leading back to the ruined ranch house. The relentless, driving snow was already falling in thick, heavy sheets. The pure white powder rapidly filled the deep, desperate footprints of the runaway woman. By the time the pale, gray dawn broke over the jagged peaks, the raging mountain would completely erase all evidence of her desperate arrival. She was truly safe from the judging, cruel eyes of the lower valley. Silas returned slowly to the broken porch of the homestead. He wiped the freezing rain from his thick, wild beard. He stepped quietly back into the ruined parlor. The small fire still crackled happily in the stone hearth, casting a warm, golden glow across the destroyed room. The towering woman remained in a deep, exhausted slumber. She was curled tightly beneath the heavy deerskin coat of the mountain man. However, a steady stream of icy water now dripped constantly from the broken wooden rafters directly above her head. The stoic giant set his empty rifle against the decaying wall. He moved toward the collapsed corner of the dark room. He lifted a massive, waterlogged beam of solid oak timber. A normal man would need 3 strong draft horses and thick ropes to drag the heavy wood. Silas hoisted the enormous, crushing timber onto his broad shoulder without a single groan. The sheer weight of the wet wood would instantly shatter a normal spine. But the thick, dense muscles of his massive back and powerful shoulders coiled and locked into place like heavy iron cables. He carried the massive load to the center of the room. He reached up with his free hand. He braced the thick oak heavily against the sagging ceiling, sliding the wood perfectly into the rotten, broken joint. He wedged a large, thick piece of heavy waxed canvas over the remaining gap. The icy leak stopped instantly. It was a flawless, completely silent display of overwhelming physical strength used entirely for gentle, unseen protection. Silas looked down at the sleeping giantess. He rubbed the smooth, heavy silver band on his left thumb. The thick metal was cold against his scarred skin. He stared at the dark dirt and heavy, ugly bruising on the thick, powerful forearms of the sleeping woman. The world was a deeply cruel, unforgiving place for people possessing immense physical size. The polite society of normal men demanded giants to be mindless, terrifying monsters to populate their dark nightmares, or silent, uncomplaining mules to pull their heavy burdens. If a giant ever showed natural fear, the cruel world called them pathetic cowards. If a giant ever showed righteous anger, the world demanded their immediate, violent destruction. The towering woman sleeping peacefully on the hard floor had clearly refused to be broken by the whips and heavy chains of normal men, and the cruel world had punished her deeply for the bold rebellion. Silas unbuckled the worn leather saddlebag resting against the stone hearth. He withdrew a large, heavy parcel wrapped in thick oiled paper. He placed the package gently on a dry stone near the warm fire. He unwrapped the folded edges to reveal thick, generous cuts of smoked venison, dried mountain apples, and a large, heavy piece of hard-baked bread. He set a battered tin canteen of fresh, unfrozen water directly beside the food. He provided enough rich sustenance to feed a massive, starving body for 3 entire days. The mountain man stood up slowly. The pale, gray light of the approaching dawn began to filter softly through the broken glass of the parlor windows. He could not remain in the small room. The sudden, unexpected sight of a towering, scarred wild man would certainly terrify the vulnerable woman upon her waking. He needed to offer her the simple dignity of choice. Silas stepped slowly out of the ruined house. He moved silently to the safety of the old, leaning timber barn standing 50 yards away in the snow. He climbed easily into the dark, dry hayloft. Through a wide, broken gap in the wooden barn wall, he possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the parlor window. He crossed his massive arms over his broad chest and waited patiently in the silent, freezing cold. Inside the ruined house, the bright, golden light of the morning sun finally touched the dusty, bruised cheek of Elara. The giant woman shifted heavily on the wooden floor. Every massive muscle in the towering body of Elara ached with a dull, relentless throb. The deep, heavy exhaustion anchored her thick bones to the floorboards. She opened her dark, weary eyes. The immediate, terrifying memory of the freezing mountain storm rushed back into her mind. She instinctively braced her powerful body for the biting, deadly cold of the mountain wind. She expected the familiar, sharp agony of frostbite on her rough skin. The cold never came. Instead, a thick, enveloping heat wrapped securely around her broad shoulders. Elara sat up slowly. The heavy, fur-lined deerskin coat slid smoothly from her body. She stared at the enormous garment in absolute, silent shock. The coat was impossibly large, built for a man possessing the massive, terrifying proportions of a mountain. She touched the thick, warm fur with her scarred fingers. The comforting scent of wood smoke, crushed pine needles, and clean rain lingered deep in the old leather. She looked quickly around the quiet, empty room. The small fire in the hearth was still warm, carefully banked with thick pine logs to last through the entire morning. She looked up at the damaged ceiling. A massive oak beam, far too heavy for any normal human to ever lift, was perfectly wedged into the broken rafters, holding back the weight of the storm. Then, Elara saw the heavy pile of food resting on the dry stone. The stomach of the giant woman tightened with overwhelming hunger, but her beating heart hammered with sudden, intense fear. She was entirely alone in a forgotten, ruined house high in the treacherous peaks. Yet, A phantom protector of unimaginable physical strength had kept her warm. Fixed the heavy, broken roof, and offered a feast fit for a starving giant. She stood up slowly to her full, towering height. Her dark head nearly brushed the patched wooden ceiling. She looked down at the dusty floorboards. Beside the cold ashes of the hearth, she saw a single, massive footprint pressed deep into the dry dirt. The boot print was enormous. It was the undeniable mark of a towering titan. Elara stared quietly at the heavy food, the warm deerskin coat, and the solid, repaired roof. The cruel men of the lower valley only used their hands to strike her or shackle her powerful arms. This invisible mountain giant used his overwhelming strength to offer a silent, sacred sanctuary. She walked slowly to the broken window. She looked out into the vast, snowy expanse of the silent mountain trees. The white forest was completely still. She clutched the heavy deerskin coat tightly against her broad chest. The radiating warmth from the thick leather felt like the safest embrace she had ever known in her tragic life. But the invisible titan was still out there, watching silently from the deep, freezing shadows of the mountain. Elara swallowed hard, her racing pulse pounding with a terrifying mixture of deep gratitude and pure, suffocating dread. Would the towering woman risk staying in the quiet ruins to face the massive stranger who saved her? Or would the fear of the invisible giant drive her back into the deadly, freezing wild? Elara stepped away from the broken window. The driving hunger in the massive stomach of the giant woman completely defeated the lingering dread in her chest. She moved slowly back to the warm stone hearth. She sat heavily upon the dusty, uneven floorboards. The towering woman reached for the package of food. She tore a large, heavy piece of the hard-baked bread with her thick, powerful hands. She ate the thick smoked venison in absolute silence. The rich, salty meat provided immediate, desperate strength to her deeply exhausted muscles. The warm, dark sanctuary of the ruined house wrapped gently around her broad shoulders. Outside, in the freezing shadows of the leaning timber barn, the broad chest of Silas rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. The towering mountain man watched the pale, gray smoke drift gently from the broken stone chimney. The wild runaway had chosen to stay. The stoic giant rubbed the smooth, heavy silver band on his left thumb. The quiet, recurring habit always surfaced whenever deep, protective thoughts consumed the mind of the solitary man. He knew the small fire in the parlor would not last through the bitter, freezing afternoon. He needed to bring dry wood to the porch. He did not want to frighten the towering woman. But the brutal, unforgiving cold of the mountain demanded immediate action. Silas climbed down slowly from the dark hayloft. He walked to the covered woodpile behind the barn. He gathered a massive stack of split pine logs into his incredibly thick, muscular arms. He carried a heavy load of timber capable of instantly breaking the spine of a normal man. He walked slowly across the deep, white snow of the yard. His heavy leather boots crunched loudly in the quiet winter air. The noise was a deliberate, steady sound meant to announce his towering approach. He did not want to surprise the guarded survivor. Inside the parlor, the sharp ears of Elara caught the heavy, rhythmic footfalls. The giant woman stood up instantly. Her dark, wary eyes locked entirely on the empty doorway. She braced her powerful, thick legs. The heavy muscles of her broad shoulders coiled tight with sudden, defensive tension. The breath hitched deep in her throat. The massive frame of Silas filled the broken doorway. The sheer physical reality of his towering presence stole the breath from the lungs of Elara. The mountain man ducked his massive, shaggy head to pass beneath the low wooden frame. He stood completely still inside the dim parlor. The heavy and rough timber of the floor groaned loudly under the immense combined weight of the two towering figures. The two giants stared at one another in absolute, stunned silence. The physical parity between them was a breathtaking, staggering sight. Elara stood 6 feet and 5 inches tall, possessing the broad, heavy shoulders of a seasoned brawler. Yet, she had to tilt her dark head upward to meet the quiet, watchful eyes of the wild stranger. Silas stood nearly 7 feet tall. He was a terrifying, massive wall of scarred muscle, wild dark beard, and heavy bone. The thick, tattered woolen shirt of the mountain man clung tightly to his massive chest. The sleeves were cut away entirely, exposing thick, heavily scarred arms rivaling the thick trunks of ancient oak trees. A single piece of heavy pine slipped from the massive stack in the arms of Silas. The log clattered loudly onto the wooden floor, rolling to a stop directly between the heavy boots of the two giants. Both towering figures leaned forward at the exact same moment to retrieve the fallen wood. The massive right hand of Silas and the thick, powerful left hand of Elara hovered just an inch apart over the rough pine bark. The sheer, identical size of their giant hands was a profound revelation. The thick knuckles of Silas were covered in pale, old scars from years of brutal mountain survival. The heavy knuckles of Elara were dark with fresh, purple bruises from fighting the cruel men of the lower valley. Silas pulled his massive hand back slowly. He allowed the giant woman to lift the heavy log. "I brought wood." The deep, rumbling voice of the mountain giant vibrated softly in the cold air. Elara stood up. She held the heavy log with effortless, quiet strength. She stared at his wild, bearded face. The dark eyes of the wild stranger did not hold the usual, cruel mixture of disgust and pure terror she always saw in the faces of normal men. The dark eyes of the giant held only deep, quiet understanding. The fierce, intimidating man looked at her powerful, heavily muscled physique with pure, silent respect. For the first time in her tragic, difficult life, Elara felt completely normal, standing in front of another human being. The profound realization settled softly over her battered heart. Silas stepped slowly toward the stone hearth. He kept his massive movements deliberately slow and heavily telegraphed. He did not want the wary woman to feel trapped in the small room. He set the heavy stack of dry logs carefully onto the floor. He stepped backward immediately, offering her the wide physical space she desperately needed to feel secure. Elara picked up the heavy, fur-lined deerskin coat from the wooden crate. She held the thick leather out toward the towering man. "Thank you." The voice of the giant woman was surprisingly gentle, holding a rough, quiet dignity that matched her immense physical presence. Silas paused. He looked at the heavy coat, then at the bruised, thick forearms of the towering woman. The bitter cold of the storm still seeped slowly through the broken walls of the old house. "Keep the coat," the stoic man offered the short, quiet command. He raised his massive right hand, pressing the flat palm heavily against the center of his broad, muscular chest. "I do not feel the cold." Elara slowly lowered the heavy leather garment. The tense, hardened corners of her weary mouth softened into a faint, tentative expression of pure gratitude. A fragile, unspoken truce settled perfectly over the dusty room. The cold air between the two giants lost the sharp, jagged edge of pure panic. They were two massive, deeply wounded creatures recognizing the mirrored, heavy scars of profound isolation in one another. Silas turned his broad back toward the comforting warmth of the fire. He walked slowly back to the broken doorway. He stopped beneath the sagging wooden frame. He looked back over his massive, heavily muscled shoulder. The barn is dry. The low, heavy rumble of his voice carried through the freezing wind. I will sleep there. The house is yours. Elara nodded her dark head once. The silent, powerful agreement was firmly struck. The towering mountain man stepped out into the freezing, driving snow, leaving the giant woman entirely alone in the warmth of the parlor. The heavy, sweeping blizzard continued to bury the ruined ranch in a pure, isolating blanket of white powder. Inside the warm house, Elara wrapped the massive deerskin coat tightly around her broad shoulders. The terrifying giant in the dark barn was not a cruel monster. He was a silent, incredibly powerful protector, offering the most precious gift she had ever received. The gift was absolute safety. But the dark, heavy isolation of the winter mountain would last for many brutal months. The ruined property was a tightly confined space. They were two fiercely independent survivors, deeply accustomed to absolute solitude. The quiet sanctuary forced the two massive souls into an intimate, unavoidable proximity. Can a fragile, silent truce between two wildly guarded, heavily scarred giants survive the long, freezing winter? Or is a profound, emotional collision absolutely inevitable? The brutal wind of the high mountain did not relent. It howled through the deep valley like a wounded beast, throwing thick sheets of sharp ice against the frail wooden walls of the ruined house. Inside the dark parlor, Elara watched the massive, waterlogged beams of the ceiling groan under the heavy, mounting pressure of the fresh snow. The small, dancing fire in the stone hearth flickered desperately against the freezing draft. She wrapped the heavy deerskin coat tighter over her incredibly broad shoulders. The terrifying, undeniable power of the winter storm was overwhelming. The deep, creeping cold sought to claim everything living in the jagged peaks. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed loudly through the small room. The violent sound of splintering wood entirely masked the howling wind. The entire eastern wall of the parlor buckled violently inward. The heavy, dry rot of the ancient timber finally surrendered to the crushing weight of the ice. A massive rush of freezing, white snow exploded into the room. The heavy wooden door of the parlor burst open. The massive frame of Silas filled the broken entryway, surrounded by a swirling, chaotic cloud of pure white powder. The stoic giant did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged across the uneven, dusty floorboards toward the failing wall. The massive vertical timber supporting the main roof was snapping rapidly under the immense, crushing weight of the ice. Silas threw his incredibly broad, muscular shoulders heavily against the thick oak. The thick, corded muscles in the legs of the giant man locked firmly into place. He let out a low, heavy grunt of immense physical exertion. The terrifying mass of the mountain man pushed violently against the collapsing structure. But the crushing weight of the damaged roof was simply too great for one man. Even a titan of his incredible size could not hold the heavy timber forever. The thick, scarred leather boots of Silas began to slide slowly backward across the dusty floorboards. The deep, heavy groaning of the breaking wood signaled total destruction. Elara dropped the heavy deerskin coat onto the floor. She rushed rapidly toward the buckling wall. The giant woman did not pause in fear. She stepped directly beside the towering man. She planted her heavy, thick leather boots firmly onto the floorboards. She raised her thick, incredibly powerful arms. She pressed her massive, calloused hands flat against the rough wood of the splintering beam. positioning herself directly next to the broad, heavy shoulder of Silas. The two giants pushed heavily together. The explosive power of their combined strength was magnificent. The heavy, dense muscles in the thick arms of Elara surged with immense, undeniable force. The massive chest of Silas expanded rapidly as he drove the full weight of his towering body upward. They moved in perfect, completely unspoken synchronization. The heavy timber groaned loudly in protest. Then slowly, specters steadily began to rise back into proper alignment. They held the massive beam steady, their towering bodies pressed closely together in the freezing dark. The heavy, rhythmic breathing of Elara perfectly matched the deep, powerful breaths of Silas. For the first time in her entire tragic life, the giant woman felt the profound, overwhelming relief of shared physical burden. She was always the strongest creature in every room, forced to carry the heaviest loads and suffer the cruelest punishments alone. Now, pushing fiercely against the crushing weight of the world, she possessed an absolute, equal partner. How? Silas reached down quickly with his massive right hand, keeping his broad left shoulder securely pinned against the heavy wood. He blindly grabbed a thick, iron-reinforced wooden brace resting on the dusty floor. He slammed the heavy object heavily against the broken joint of the beam. "Hold it." The deep, vibrating voice of Silas rumbled quietly in the cold air. Elara locked her thick, muscular legs. She took the entire, crushing weight of the roof upon her own broad shoulders. The incredible display of raw physical power stunned the mountain man. He quickly hammered the thick iron spikes deep into the dry wood, using the heavy, steel-reinforced heel of his boot. The loud, ringing strikes secured the brace tightly into the wooden frame. The wall finally held firm. The heavy, threatening creak of the roof settled into absolute silence. Silas stepped back slowly. He wiped the heavy sweat from his dark, wild brow. Elara lowered her powerful arms. The heavy, corded muscles in her broad back ached deeply from the immense, sudden effort. She turned her dark, weary head to look at the towering man beside her. The stoic giant stood perfectly still in the dim, golden light of the fire. The intense eyes of Silas watched her with profound, quiet awe. He rubbed the smooth, heavy silver band on his left thumb. The deep, recurring habit quickly settled the racing thoughts in his massive mind. He had witnessed many incredible feats of pure strength during his lonely years in the high country. But the quiet, dignified power of the towering woman was a majestic, beautiful revelation. She did not flinch from the brutal danger. She met the overwhelming force of the mountain with equal, unbreakable resolve. Silas walked slowly toward the stone hearth. He picked up the discarded deerskin coat from the dusty floor. He returned quietly to the center of the room. With surprising, immense gentleness, Silas draped the heavy leather softly over the broad, heavy shoulders of Elara. Thus, simple, highly protective action sent a profound wave of deep warmth straight through the battered heart of the runaway woman. The thick, scarred hands of Silas lingered for a fraction of a second near the rough collar of the heavy coat. The brief, absolutely silent touch offered an entire world of emotional safety. He did not look at her with fear. He looked at her with pure, heavy respect. Elara walked back slowly to the warm fire. She sat heavily upon the wooden floorboards, pulling the comforting leather tight around her massive frame. Silas did not immediately return to the freezing darkness of the barn. The brutal storm outside raged with terrifying, endless fury. but the small room suddenly felt incredibly secure. The towering mountain man sat down quietly, on the opposite side of the glowing hearth. He reached into his heavy vest and produced the battered tin canteen. He offered the fresh water across the warm flames. Elara accepted the metal container with a quiet nod. She drank deeply, the cold water soothing her dry throat. She handed the heavy canteen back to the massive man. Their thick, bruised fingers brushed lightly against the cold metal. The tiny fiber, fleeting point of contact carried a heavy, electric spark of deep understanding. The two giants sat together in absolute, peaceful silence. They listened closely to the violent wind, tearing uselessly at the repaired wooden walls. The unspoken cooperation forged a new, unbreakable layer of pure trust between their guarded souls. The sheer physical competence they shared was, undeniably, a vital tool for desperate survival. However, the heavy, lonely silence between them was no longer filled with tense, terrifying watchfulness. The quiet sanctuary of the ruined house was suddenly filled with an overwhelming, silent comfort. Elara looked at the massive, shadowed silhouette of the stoic man across the dancing flames. The heavy, isolating armor securely wrapped around her weary heart began to crack. She felt a terrifying, beautiful spark of pure belonging. The imposing mountain man was a giant wall of absolute safety, but the freezing winter was long, and the deep, hidden emotional wounds inside their massive chests were still raw and heavily bleeding. The profound physical synchronization saved the wooden walls of the house, but the true danger rested entirely in the unspoken emotions growing rapidly between them. Does this incredible, shared physical competence merely mask a desperate, hidden need for deep emotional connection? Or is the fragile sanctuary truly just a temporary alliance for cold survival? The violent howling of the freezing wind finally ceased on the morning of the fourth day. The golden light of the winter sun pierced the heavy, broken clouds of the high mountain. The deep, pure white snow buried the ruined house in absolute, unbroken silence. Inside the warm parlor, the small fire snapped cheerfully within the stone hearth, pushing the bitter cold into the far corners of the dusty room. Silas entered through the heavy wooden door. The broad, massive shoulders of the stoic man easily carried a massive, completely frozen quarter of wild elk. The dark, rich meat was heavily encased in a thick, glittering layer of solid ice. Preparing the heavy food for the long, isolating winter was a highly difficult, demanding task. He walked slowly across the room. He placed the heavy, frozen quarter upon the thick oak table in the center of the parlor. He drew a long, razor-sharp hunting knife from the worn leather sheath resting upon his broad hip. The sharp, clean scent of the frozen pine mingled perfectly with the rich, metallic smell of the fresh meat. The heavy steel blade in the right hand of Silas scraped loudly against the frozen white bone, sending tiny, shimmering shards of ice scattering across the rough timber of the table. Silas gripped the heavy leg of the elk with his massive left hand. He attempted to carve the frozen muscle. The sheer, punishing cold made the dark meat as solid as heavy stone. The steel blade slipped slightly, grazing the thick leather covering the thumb of the giant man. He let out a low, heavy grunt, adjusting his massive grip to force the stubborn knife deeper into the frozen tissue. Elara stood up quietly from the warm hearth. She walked slowly to the wooden table. She did not wait for an invitation. She did not ask for permission to help. The unspoken, profound cooperation of the two towering giants was already a natural, living rhythm in the small room. The giant woman reached across the wide wooden table. She clamped her incredibly thick, powerful hands around the frozen bone. She locked her broad shoulders, holding the massive quarter of meat absolutely and entirely still against the heavy, downward force of the knife. Silas paused. He looked up into the dark, weary eyes of the towering woman. A profound, quiet gratitude filled the broad chest of the mountain man. He nodded his wild, shaggy head once. He began to carve the thick meat with steady, incredibly powerful strokes. The physical synchronization of the massive pair transformed the grueling, punishing chore into a quiet, peaceful dance. Elara perfectly anticipated every deliberate movement of the heavy knife. She shifted the immense weight of the frozen elk exactly when the stoic man needed a new angle. The quiet rhythm of their shared, heavy labor brought a deep, peaceful warmth to the freezing morning. The heavy canvas sleeves of the work shirt worn by Elara were rolled high above her thick elbows. As she rotated the frozen meat, the rough fabric slipped further down her massive arm, exposing the pale skin of her thick forearm. The sharp steel blade in the right hand of Silas suddenly stopped moving. There, deeply etched into the thick, corded muscle of her left wrist, was a terrible benisbat, jagged scar. It was a thick, raised ring of pale, badly damaged flesh entirely encircling the heavy joint. The brutal, undeniable mark of heavy iron shackles. The deep scar told a harrowing, completely silent story of absolute captivity, endless struggle, and profound human cruelty. It was not a mark of rightful justice. It was the cruel brand of forced, punishing labor. Silas stared silently at the heavy scar. The steady breathing of the giant man slowed to a heavy, deliberate crawl. He reached out slowly with his left hand. He rubbed the smooth, heavy silver band upon his thumb. The quiet, recurring action instantly grounded the sudden, violent surge of pure anger rising in his massive chest. The cruel men of the civilized world had actually chained the magnificent, towering woman like a wild, dangerous beast. Elara completely froze. The heavy muscles in her broad back suddenly became rigid with intense, suffocating fear. The eyes of the giant woman dropped quickly to the exposed, ugly scar. The terrified heart inside her massive chest beat with a frantic, heavy panic. The normal men of the lower valley always demanded the painful story. They always demanded to know the dark history of the heavy shackles. They always judged her instantly as a dangerous, escaped criminal entirely unworthy of basic dignity. She began to slowly pull her heavy arm away from the wooden table. The deep, overwhelming instinct to hide her terrible shame completely paralyzed her rational mind. Silas did not ask the painful question. He did not demand the bitter truth. The mountain man simply shifted his massive grip upon the hunting knife. He reached out with his left hand. He did not grab the thick wrist of the giant woman. He did not offer the suffocating, deeply humiliating weight of pity. Instead, he gently guided the sharp blade safely away from her exposed skin. He placed his heavily scarred fingers firmly against the frozen bone of the elk, resting his massive hand exactly beside hers to support the immense weight. "Hold it steady right here." The deep, gentle rumble of his voice carried no judgment, no fear, and absolutely no cruel curiosity. Elara stopped pulling away. She looked closely at the wild, bearded face of Silas. The stoic giant kept his dark, watchful eyes firmly upon the task. He treated the terrible, heavy scar as if it were nothing more than a natural scratch from a mountain bramble. He offered absolute, unbreakable validation. He recognized the heavy mark of brutal survival, and he deeply respected the magnificent survivor. to be truly seen by another human being, and yet remain completely unquestioned, is a rare and beautiful mercy. The deepest, most agonizing wounds of the human heart never require spoken words to be understood by those who have also bled in the dark. The total silence of the stoic mountain man was not cold ignorance. It was the absolute highest form of pure respect. The cruel world always demanded loud, painful explanations from giants. Silas only offered a quiet, unshakable sanctuary. Elara swallowed the heavy, emotional lump forming deep in her dry throat. The terrifying panic in her broad chest melted into a profound, overwhelming wave of pure relief. She leaned forward, pressing her massive, powerful hands firmly against the frozen meat once again. The morning passed, slowly. The thick cuts of rich meat piled high upon the wooden table. The small, warm room filled with a beautiful, shared purpose. The heavy, isolating walls protecting the deeply wounded heart of Elara cracked a little further. The invisible mountain giant was proving to be a man of immense, honorable character. However, the dark, heavy shadow of the violent past remained entirely unspoken. The heavy iron shackles belonged to a cruel master, a ruthless man who surely noticed the sudden disappearance of his most valuable, towering worker. What specific, terrifying horror left the deep, terrible mark of bondage upon the powerful wrist of the giant woman? And will she ever find the absolute courage to trust the stoic mountain man with the painful, dangerous truth before the dark past inevitably returns to claim her? The deep, heavy snow of the lower valley finally melted enough to expose the narrow, treacherous trail leading down the mountain. The quiet sanctuary of the ruined house required vital, absolute necessities to survive the remainder of the freezing, endless winter. The massive cuts of wild elk meat desperately needed heavy sacks of coarse salt to cure properly. The empty iron lanterns required fresh kerosene. Silas prepared the heavy wooden wagon in the pale, gray light of the early dawn. He harnessed the thick, heavily muscled draft horse to the wooden frame. He looked toward the broken porch of the house. Elara stood quietly near the open door. The towering woman wore the massive, fur-lined deerskin coat. She perfectly understood the absolute necessity of the dangerous journey. The long, treacherous path required two incredibly strong individuals to move the heavy, fallen timber blocking the narrow road. The long descent into the civilized world was completely silent. The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon crunched loudly against the frozen mud of the trail. The sharp, clean scent of the high mountain pines slowly faded, replaced entirely by the bitter, thick smell of burning coal and wet livestock marking the small, distant logging town. The trading post stood at the very edge of the settlement. It was a long, rough wooden building surrounded by a wide, muddy street. Silas halted the massive draft horse near the wooden hitching rail. He stepped down heavily from the wagon. He turned toward the wooden bench and offered his incredibly massive, scarred hand to Elara. The towering woman hesitated. She looked at the distant, moving figures of normal men walking in the muddy street. The intense, suffocating fear of public judgment tightened her incredibly broad chest. She reached out slowly, placing her thick, bruised fingers into his massive palm. The warm, firm grip of the stoic man offered a silent, steady anchor in the terrifying sea of civilization. They walked together onto the covered wooden boardwalk. The thick, heavy timber groaned loudly beneath the immense, terrifying combined weight of the two giants. The casual, busy noise of the trading post instantly died. The sudden, total silence was heavier than the thickest winter storm. Normal men and quiet women stopped perfectly still in the muddy street. They turned their heads to stare openly at the massive, towering pair. The eyes of the civilized world were completely devoid of human warmth. The stares held only dark suspicion, terrible fear, and profound, cruel curiosity. 3 rough, dirt-covered loggers stood near the open doorway of the general store. They held dented tin cups of steaming black coffee. They leaned arrogantly against the wooden wall, watching the heavy approach of the 2 towering figures. "Look at the absolute size of that monstrous creature," one man muttered loudly over the rim of his metal cup. The harsh, biting voice carried perfectly through the cold, silent air. The wild beast of the mountain finally found a suitable mate. Another man sneered, spitting dark tobacco juice into the muddy street. A terrifying, lumbering freak of a woman. They look like a pair of cursed, unnatural demons hiding in the dark woods. No decent human could ever look at a massive beast like that without feeling pure sickness. The cruel, jagged words struck the battered heart of Elara with the devastating, crushing force of a heavy iron hammer. The towering woman stopped walking. The profound, quiet dignity she felt inside the warm walls of the ruined house instantly vanished. The fragile, beautiful illusion of absolute safety shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She was back in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the cruel world. She was nothing but a massive, horrifying spectacle for normal men to violently mock and deeply degrade. Elara looked down quickly at the muddy wooden boards. The giant woman desperately tried to make her incredibly broad, powerful shoulders shrink inward. She wanted to vanish. She wanted the freezing mountain earth to open and entirely swallow her massive frame. The deep, undeniable physical strength of her powerful body was absolutely useless against the vicious, cutting blades of pure social cruelty. The hot, stinging tears of profound shame pooled rapidly in her dark, weary eyes. Silas stopped exactly beside her. The towering mountain man turned his massive, shaggy head slowly. The deep, dark eyes of Silas locked directly onto the arrogant faces of the cruel men. He did not yell. He did not draw the heavy steel knife resting upon his hip. The stoic giant simply raised his massive left hand. He began to rub the smooth, heavy silver band upon his thick thumb. The quiet, recurring habit failed entirely to calm the sudden, violent storm of pure, righteous fury erupting inside his massive chest. The tragic sight of the magnificent, towering woman shrinking in profound emotional agony tore a massive, bleeding hole through the silent armor of his soul. He knew the terrible, soul-crushing weight of their vicious laughter. He knew the absolute, agonizing pain of being viewed purely as a mindless, ugly monster. Silas stepped directly in front of Elara. He positioned his towering, incredibly massive body entirely between the cruel loggers and the trembling giantess. He became a living, unmovable wall of heavy, protective muscle. The long, dark shadow of the massive man completely enveloped the towering woman, shielding her entirely from the harsh, judging stares of the civilized world. The 3 loggers instantly stopped laughing. The terrifying, overwhelming presence of the furious mountain giant pushed the arrogant men backward against the wooden wall. The sheer, silent threat radiating from the broad chest of Silas was absolutely suffocating. Silas turned slightly, keeping his broad back squarely facing the frightened men. He looked down at Elara. The wild face of the stoic man was fiercely gentle. He reached into his deep leather pocket. He withdrew a small, beautifully carved wooden comb. He had spent 3 entirely sleepless nights, perfectly carving the delicate object from a piece of smooth, fragrant cedar. He offered the small, beautiful gift to her in the pale, gray light of the town. It was a profound, deeply public statement of undeniable worth. He did not treat her like a mindless beast of burden meant to carry heavy supplies. He treated her like a highly valued, fully dignified woman, deeply deserving of beautiful things. Elara stared at the delicate wooden comb resting in the massive, scarred palm of the giant man. She reached out slowly with her trembling, thick fingers. She took the smooth wood. The deep, crushing sadness in her massive chest fought a desperate, heavy battle against the warm, brilliant light of his absolute respect. They walked past the silent, terrified men and entered the dark, quiet general store. The heavy air inside smelled deeply of roasted coffee beans and dry canvas. The transaction was completely silent. Silas paid for the heavy sacks of salt with thick silver coins. He carried the massive, crushing weight of the heavy supplies entirely alone, absolutely refusing to let Elara lift a single burden in front of the judging eyes of the town. He offered her total, complete service to perfectly restore her stolen dignity. But the long, silent journey back up the freezing mountain was terribly heavy. The cruel, vicious words of the logging men echoed constantly inside the weary mind of the runaway woman. The warm sanctuary of the ruined house no longer felt truly isolated from the deep, dark horrors of the world below. Will the overwhelming cruelty of the civilized world drive the terrified giantess away into the freezing wilderness before she finds true, lasting safety? Or will the stoic mountain man finally break his long, heavy silence to formally defend the magnificent woman, slowly claiming his frozen heart? The journey of the heavy wagon back to the high peaks was wrapped in profound, heavy silence. The brutal, vicious words of the logging men echoed relentlessly within the weary mind of Elara. She stared out at the freezing, endless expanse of the deep pine forests. The cruel world of normal men demanded the total destruction of giants. Yet, the towering mountain man seated beside her had thrown his massive, intimidating shadow over her trembling form without a single second of hesitation. He offered absolute protection in the very center of a hostile town. They arrived at the ruined homestead as the pale afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks. Silas halted the heavy draft horse near the leaning timber barn. The stoic giant unloaded the massive sacks of salt entirely alone. He gestured silently toward the warmth of the parlor. He wanted the giant woman to rest. He wanted the bitter memory of the town to melt away in the quiet, golden heat of the fire. Elara entered the dim parlor. The small room felt incredibly empty. The deep, heavy sadness still pressed firmly against the broad chest of the towering woman. She needed to move her powerful hands. She needed the grounding rhythm of hard, physical labor to quiet the terrifying storm inside her weary head. She knelt heavily beside the stone hearth. The thick ashes of the morning fire spilled out across the dusty floorboards. She began to carefully sweep the gray soot using a bundle of dry pine branches. The thick, heavily muscled fingers of Elara brushed against a loose, flat stone resting at the very edge of the deep hearth. The heavy rock shifted slightly under her immense physical strength. She paused. She gripped the cold edges of the stone and pulled it smoothly away from the wall. A small, dark hollow existed directly beneath the heavy floorboard. Inside the hidden space rested a small, square wooden box carefully wrapped in thick, oiled canvas. Elara pulled the heavy box into the light of the room. She did not intend to pry into the dark secrets of the mountain man. She only wished to return the loose stone to proper alignment. However, The oiled canvas was loose, entirely exposing the intricate, beautiful carvings covering the smooth wooden lid. The delicate, precise craftsmanship exactly matched the beautiful cedar comb, resting currently inside the deep pocket of her work shirt. She gently lifted the wooden lid. The vivid, fragile scent of crushed mountain lavender and old, perfectly polished leather instantly filled the cold air of the quiet room. Elara looked down into the small box. The breath vanished entirely from her heavy lungs. Resting upon a bed of soft, folded white wool was a single, tiny leather shoe. It was the worn, scuffed boot of a very young child. The soft brown leather was deeply creased from the happy, running steps of a small boy. A tiny, polished silver buckle rested upon the top of the delicate shoe. Elara reached into the box with trembling, thick fingers. She lifted the tiny shoe into the golden light. The delicate object looked impossibly small and fragile, resting within the vast, heavily scarred palm of the giant woman. The sheer contrast between the massive, overwhelming strength of her bruised hands and the innocent, tiny shoe was profoundly heartbreaking. A massive paradigm shift violently rocked the entire foundation of her weary soul. The quiet, terrifying giant of the mountain was not simply a wild beast, hiding from the cruel judgment of the civilized world. He was not a dangerous outcast, avoiding the heavy chains of the law. He was a father. He was a deeply broken, grieving father. The absolute, impenetrable silence of Silas was not a wall of cold indifference. It was a heavy, suffocating tomb built perfectly around a shattered heart. The giant man lived entirely alone in the freezing, brutal peaks because the tragic loss of his tiny, beautiful child made the lower valleys completely unbearable. The heavy, dragging footfalls of heavy leather boots sounded upon the wooden porch. Elara completely froze. She turned her dark, weary head. Silas ducked his massive shoulders beneath the broken doorframe. The towering mountain man stepped into the parlor. He carried a fresh stack of split pine logs. He stopped perfectly still. The dark, intense eyes of Silas dropped immediately to the tiny leather shoe resting within the massive hands of Elara. The heavy stack of pine logs slipped instantly from his thick, powerful arms. The wood crashed violently onto the dusty floorboards. The loud, deafening noise echoed sharply through the silent house. The massive chest of the stoic giant heaved with sudden, terrifying panic. He did not step forward. He did not shout in sudden, violent anger. Instead, the towering man stepped backward. The incredibly powerful shoulders of Silas sagged entirely. He reached up quickly with his massive left hand. He began to frantically rub the smooth, heavy silver band upon his thick thumb. Elara looked closely at the moving hand of the giant man. The smooth silver band upon his scarred thumb perfectly matched the tiny silver buckle upon the worn shoe of the child. It was a physical, absolute anchor to a ghost. The bitter winter fever. The deep, heavy rumble of his voice cracked into a devastating, ragged whisper. It was the absolute first time the fierce mountain man sounded deeply vulnerable. He stared at the tiny shoe. The dark eyes of Silas filled instantly with profound, agonizing sorrow. The doctor in the town refused the journey. The stoic giant continued softly. The painful, broken words tumbled slowly from the wild beard. They feared the deep snow. They feared the lonely cabin of the giant. My beautiful boy burned in the dark. The strength of my hands could move heavy timber and break solid stone. But the massive strength of my heavy arms could not stop the hot fever. I could not save the only light of my tragic life. The heavy tears spilled freely down the rough, dirty cheeks of the towering mountain man. The terrifying beast of the high pass was entirely reduced to a weeping, helpless father, standing in the cold shadows of the broken room. Elara did not run from the intense, overwhelming grief. She did not offer empty, meaningless platitudes. The giant woman stood up slowly to her full, towering height. She walked deliberately across the dusty floorboards. She stopped exactly in front of the massive, weeping titan. She reached out with her right hand. She did not hand the tiny shoe back to him. Instead, she placed her incredibly thick, calloused palm softly against the massive, trembling chest of Silas. She placed her warm hand directly over his shattered, beating heart. The touch of the giant woman was astonishingly gentle. The profound warmth of her powerful hand instantly grounded the terrifying, spiraling grief of the mountain man. Silas let out a long, heavy, shuddering breath. He slowly raised his massive right hand. He placed his thick, heavily scarred fingers gently over the bruised knuckles of Elara. He held her powerful hand firmly against his chest. They stood together in the quiet, dim light of the ruined parlor. The heavy, protective covenant between them permanently shifted. Silas was no longer the invisible, invincible protector. He was a deeply wounded soul in desperate need of a safe sanctuary. Elara realized she possessed the emotional strength to finally offer the broken giant the profound comfort he desperately required. But as the deep, meaningful connection settled firmly over their massive shoulders, a dark, terrifying dread coiled instantly within the stomach of the runaway woman. Silas possessed a tragic past defined by innocent, unavoidable tragedy. He was an honorable man destroyed by absolute heartbreak. The deep, jagged scar upon the thick wrist of Elara was altogether different. Her dark past was defined by terrible violence, stolen debts, and dangerous men. Now that the giant woman finally understood the pure, beautiful heart of the grieving father, she faced a horrifying reality. Could the broken, grieving mountain man survive the violent, terrifying storm of her own dark secret? Or would the approaching danger completely destroy the fragile, beautiful sanctuary they were desperately trying to build? The firelight danced across the rough-hewn walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to reach out toward the two giants. Silas remained standing exactly where he had stopped, his massive frame still trembling with the aftershocks of a grief that had been locked away for nearly a decade. Elara did not move her hand from his chest. She could feel the heavy, irregular rhythm of his heart beating against her palm, a physical manifestation of a spirit that had been forced to carry an impossible burden in absolute, crushing silence. She looked up, meeting his eyes. The wild, dark gaze that had once been the primary source of her intimidation now revealed a terrifying depth of vulnerability. It was as if a massive dam had finally breached, and the sheer force of the water was threatening to sweep them both away into the dark. Silas exhaled, a sound that was half sob and half sigh, and he leaned his forehead forward, resting it lightly against the top of her dark, braided hair. He was taller, yet in this moment of shared agony, he seemed to be leaning on her for the very existence of his strength. The towering mountain man, who had spent years acting as an immovable pillar of the wilderness, was finally letting the weight of his humanity be seen. "I thought," he murmured, his voice thick with the grit of old, dormant pain, that if I did not speak the name, the tragedy would lose its power. I was a fool. Elara did not answer with words. She knew that any promise to make it better would be a lie, and he did not need comfort built on falsehoods. Instead, she tightened her hold on his hand, the one that covered hers, against his chest. She moved her other hand, the one holding the tiny leather shoe, and tucked it carefully back into the oiled canvas. She did not replace the stone in the hearth. She placed the box gently on the edge of the mantel, a quiet acknowledgement that the memory of his son was now part of the sanctuary they shared. The dynamic between them had undergone a fundamental shift. Before, this night, Silas had been the provider, the silent shadow who repaired the roof and brought the meat, and Elara had been the recipient of his grace, always watching for the moment the world would demand her exit. Now, the roles were fluid. She saw the man behind the myth, the father who had sat in the dark and carved tiny toys to stave off the silence of his own house. And he saw in her, for the first time, not just a fellow giant, but a woman who was capable of holding the pieces of his shattered life without crumbling. As the night deepened, the house grew colder, but neither moved to retreat to the barn. Silas finally pulled back, though he did not drop her hand. He walked to the center of the room and began to move with a renewed, albeit fragile, purpose. He set about building up the fire, his movements less guarded, less performative of the stoic, iron-willed mountain man. He was simply Silas. Elara watched him. She began to busy herself with the mundane tasks of the homestead, tasks she had previously only done in the periphery, afraid to claim space in his world. She mended the torn hem of his heavy wool shirt, her thick, calloused fingers moving with surprising dexterity as she pulled the needle through the coarse fabric. She did not have to ask where the supplies were. She had been watching him long enough to know the location of every tool and every scrap of thread in the room. There was a profound comfort in the silence now. It was no longer the heavy, stifling silence of two strangers waiting for the other to be revealed as a threat. It was the companionable silence of two people who had stripped away the primary layers of their defenses. Silas watched her from the fire. He was observing the way she worked, the way her immense hands handled the needle with such delicate precision. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the way she carried herself, no longer trying to make herself small to hide from the judgment of the world. In the safety of the parlor, she was reclaiming her stature. She was not a beast of burden. She was the heart of the home he had forgotten how to build. "You have a steady hand," he said finally, his voice lacking the jagged edge of his earlier tears. Elara looked up, a genuine smile touching her lips. "I spent years mending the things that were broken by those who did not care if they stayed whole. I learned that what you fix, you learn to cherish." Silas nodded slowly. The implication of her words hung in the air, weighted with the history of her own suffering. He walked over to where she sat and leaned against the wooden support pillar, his height dwarfing the room even in his relaxed state. He was beginning to understand that the physical labor they shared, the chopping of wood, the hauling of water, the fixing of walls, was the language they used to express what their hearts were not yet ready to articulate. "I have not sat in this room with another soul," he began, then paused, finding the words difficult. "Since the winter the boy passed. I used to think the house itself was the enemy. I kept the roof just tight enough to keep the snow out, but I left the floorboards rotten. I wanted the house to fall down around me." Elara set the shirt aside. She reached out, placing her hand on the wooden pillar near his arm. "The house did not fall, Silas. You kept it standing. And now, you are not here, alone." The weight of her words seemed to press into the very marrow of his bones. He turned, looking down at her, And, for the first time, there was a glimmer of something more than grief in his eyes. There was an emerging, tentative spark of hope. The night passed with the two of them, working in tandem. They shared the last of the evening meal. Their movements synchronized as they cleared the table and secured the fire for the night. They were building a life in the debris of a ruin, a fortress of two against the vast, indifferent wilderness. But, even as the hearth glowed with the promise of tomorrow, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, a silent reminder that they were not entirely free from the reach of the outside world. The valley had already proven it was capable of cruelty, and the mystery of Elara's departure remained a locked door she had not yet invited him to open. As they prepared to settle for the night, he in the barn, she in the parlor, the air between them felt different, charged. They had moved from survival to reliance. They were now essential to one another. "Sleep well," he said, pausing at the threshold of the door, the cold wind of the mountain already beckoning him. "You also," she replied, her voice soft in the quiet room. He disappeared into the dark, but his presence seemed to linger. Elara lay down, but sleep did not come immediately. She listened to the settling of the timber, thinking of the tiny shoe in the box. She had discovered his past, and in doing so, she had revealed the core of her own existence, a woman who was now, for the first time, willing to be protected. However, just as she drifted towards sleep, a faint, rhythmic sound tapped against the parlor window. It was not the wind. It was the distinct, repeated click of a heavy metal ring against the glass. Someone was outside, and they were testing the locks. What did the visitor want? And had they finally tracked the giantess to the one place she felt she could finally breathe? The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and undeniably intentional. Elara bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The tapping persisted, 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the brittle glass. She did not scream. She did not panic. The years of forced vigilance in the dark places of the world had trained her to be silent in the face of danger. She slid from beneath the heavy furs, her feet finding the floorboards without a sound. She moved to the side of the window, pressing her back against the rough, cold logs of the wall. Through the gap in the heavy, threadbare curtain, she peered into the night. The moon was bright, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. A figure stood on the porch, wrapped in a heavy, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light. The stranger stood remarkably still, a head taller than any man she had encountered in the valley, though he lacked the immense, singular mass of Silas. The visitor reached out again, his gloved hand tapping the glass. There was no aggression in the gesture, only a cold, unwavering patience. Elara's breath hitched. She knew that posture. It was the stance of a man who owned the land he stood upon, even if it was a ruin. It was the stance of a bill collector. Before she could decide on a course of action, the shadow of the barn shifted. Silas did not emerge with a weapon, but he moved with a focused, predatory speed that was terrifying to behold. He crossed the yard, his massive frame blending into the darkness until he was only 10 feet behind the visitor. He did not speak, he merely stood there, a mountain of silent, lethal intent. The visitor froze. He did not turn, but his shoulders tightened. "You are trespassing," Silas said. The voice was not a shout, it was the low, grinding sound of shifting tectonic plates. The visitor turned slowly, his face obscured by the brim of a wide, felt hat. "I am merely looking for a stray mountain man." a large one. One that carries a debt that has yet to be settled. Elara's hands balled into fists, her fingernails biting into her palms. That, the debt. The word was a poison. Silas stepped into the sliver of moonlight, his massive chest heaving. There are no strays here. There is only a home. You will leave, or you will be carried away. The visitor laughed. A thin, fine, brittle sound. You have no idea what you are protecting. Giant. She is not a stray. She is property of the state. And the ledger is very clear. Elara could not stand the silence a moment longer. She reached out and unlatched the heavy wooden door, swinging it wide. She stood in the threshold, the lantern light behind her, casting her massive frame into a silhouette of defiance. She did not look like the cowering runaway anymore. She looked like a queen defending her ruined castle. I am not property, she said, her voice steady and echoing across the snow. The visitor looked at her, his eyes cold and devoid of recognition. The papers disagree, woman, and the bank does not care for your sentiments. Silas didn't wait. He moved forward, his hand snapping out to grab the man by the collar of his coat, lifting him clear off the porch. The visitor's feet dangled uselessly in the air. Silas looked as if he might break the man in half, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated protection. But then, Elara stepped forward and placed a hand on the giant's massive, corded forearm. Do not, she whispered. If you spill his blood on this snow, they will bring an army to find us. Send him away with a warning. Silas held the man for a long, agonizing moment, his jaw tight enough to shatter teeth. Finally, he shoved the man backward. The visitor stumbled, landing hard in the snow, his hat tumbling off to reveal a pale, sharp-featured face. He scrambled to his feet, scrambling backward toward his horse. This is not over, the man hissed, adjusting his coat. The auction in town next week will decide the fate of this land. If you do not have the deed, you have no home. He mounted his horse and disappeared into the trees with a clatter of hooves. Silas stood on the porch for a long time, the cold wind whipping his beard. He finally turned to look at Elara. Her face was pale, the terror of the moment lingering in the way she clutched the edge of the door. He walked over and, without a word, guided her inside. The fire had died down to embers, but the room felt warmer than before. They sat at the table, the weight of the interaction pressing down on them. What debt? Silas asked, his voice raw. Elara looked at her hands. The scars on her wrists seemed to ache in the cold. My father was a foreman for a lumber baron. When the mill burned, they blamed him. They said he stole the payroll to cover his gambling. He didn't. But he was a giant of a man, too, big for them to risk a fair trial. They chained him until he broke. When he died, they passed the debt to me. They made me work the camps for 5 years, hauling timber, breaking stone, paying for a crime that never happened. Silas listened, his face a landscape of restrained rage. I ran, she continued, because they were going to sell my labor to a mine in the north, a place where giants go to die. She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, not of fear, but of the release of holding that secret for so long. I am sorry I brought this to your door, Silas. I thought this mountain was forgotten by everyone. Silas reached across the table, covering her hand with his. His touch was warm, solid, and incredibly gentle. You did not bring the darkness, Elara. The world brought it. But here, you are not a debtor. You are a woman who saved a broken man from his own silence. He squeezed her hand. A surge of affection so profound it left him speechless. It was not just respect anymore. It was an anchoring. A realization that their shared struggle was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. But the danger was not gone. The bank was coming. And for the first time, Silas had something he was terrified to lose. As they sat in the quiet, the gravity of their situation grew. They had the land, steep, but they did not have the law. And the law was coming for the woman who had finally found the courage to stand tall. The days leading up to the town auction were marked by a suffocating, heavy tension that settled over the high mountain pass. Silas and Elara moved through the homestead with a heightened, desperate efficiency. Every piece of firewood was stacked with geometric precision. Every tool was cleaned and oiled until the metal shone with a dull, matte glow. They were preparing for a battle that would not be fought with rifles or physical strength, but with the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the valley. Elara found herself watching Silas more often, her gaze lingering on the broad expanse of his shoulders as he repaired a broken latch on the barn door. He was a man composed of quiet power, yet she could see the way he rubbed the silver band on his thumb, a sign that his mind was calculating risks she did not fully understand. He was fighting for her, but he was also fighting for the small, sacred peace they had found in the wreckage of his grief. "We must go," Silas said on the morning of the auction. He did not ask, he stated it as a matter of survival. Elara stood by the small mirror in the corner of the room, smoothing the fabric of the dark, sturdy dress she had mended from scraps of spare canvas and wool. She looked powerful, her stature imposing, her presence commanding. For the first time, she did not try to hunch her shoulders or avert her eyes. She stood as a woman who had earned her place on this earth. The wagon ride to town was a stark contrast to their previous visit. The silence was not one of fear, but of grim, focused resolve. When they arrived, the town was teeming with people, the air thick with the smell of horse manure, unwashed wool, and the nervous energy of a crowd gathered for a public spectacle. As they walked toward the center square, the whispers began. The townspeople recognized them, the mountain giants. Some onlookers backed away, their faces twisted in that familiar, ugly mask of prejudice. Others watched with a morbid, greedy fascination, as if they were observing exotic beasts brought to be sold. Elara kept her chin high, though her hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles turned white. She felt the heavy, reassuring presence of Silas walking at her shoulder, his massive body serving as a wall against the cruelty of the crowd. He did not look at them, he looked only forward, his path cutting through the throng like a ship through dark water. They reached the auction stand, a raised wooden platform where a man in a sharp, stiff suit was already rattling off descriptions of land parcels. The crowd parted, a ripple of movement that betrayed their unease. The auctioneer paused, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the two giants standing before him. He was a man with a thin, cruel mouth and eyes that lacked any vestige of human empathy. He did not see people. He saw assets and liabilities. "Next lot," the auctioneer droned, his voice carrying over the silence, "is the Northern Pass homestead, currently unoccupied by any legitimate claimant. Bidding starts at 50 silver pieces." Silas stepped forward, his voice a low, resonant boom that silenced the surrounding chatter. "I am here. The land is occupied. It has been occupied for years." The crowd erupted in murmurs. The auctioneer smiled. A thin, paper-dry expression. Possession is not title, my friend. Unless you have the deed and the back taxes paid in full. The bank owns the mountain. The man who had visited their cabin, the one Elara, now knew to be a local land agent, stepped out from the back of the platform. He smiled at Elara. A slick, predatory look that made her skin crawl. He tipped his hat, his eyes tracing the line of her arm, then the breadth of her shoulders. It was a look of appraisal, as if he were already calculating how much her physical labor would bring at a private sale. I bid 60, the agent said, his eyes never leaving Elara. Silas stepped up to the platform, his massive frame looming over the auctioneer. 70. The agent laughed, stepping closer until he was just within reach of the giant's massive arm. You do not have 70. Mountain man. We know about the boy. We know about the farm that fell into ruin while you grieved. You have nothing. The agent turned his attention back to the auctioneer. 80, and I will add a bonus for the clearing of the unauthorized tenants. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Silas. His jaw was locked, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables. He did not have the coin. He had spent his savings on the supplies and the winter provisions. She realized then the true stakes of the day. It was not just the land they were losing. The agent wanted the homestead, but he also wanted her. 85. A new voice rang out from the back of the crowd. It was not Silas. It was a woman, middle-aged and sharp-eyed, standing near a group of farmers. The agent frowned, annoyed by the interruption. 90. 100, the woman countered, her voice firm. The bidding war moved rapidly, the crowd cheering as if it were a sporting event. Elara felt a surge of panic. Each number raised the price, further beyond their reach. She grabbed Silas's arm, her fingers sinking into the thick fabric of his vest. Silas. Stop, she whispered. If we do not win, we will find another way. Do not let him bait you. Silas did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the agent, who was whispering something to the auctioneer that caused the man to chuckle. Silas leaned down, his voice barely audible to anyone but her. I will not let him take you back to those camps, Elara. Not while I draw breath. His confession was simple, yet it held the weight of 1,000 promises. She realized then that he was not just fighting for the land. He was fighting to keep his heart from being torn out. 120, the agent called out, his voice gloating. He looked at Silas with a triumphant sneer. Going once. Going twice. Just as the gavel was raised, a man stepped out from the shadows near the general store, a man with graying hair and the weathered, tired look of a soldier. He looked at Silas, his expression unreadable. 125, the man said. The agent turned, his face purple with rage. Who are you? A man who remembers who held the line at the pass, the newcomer said, never taking his eyes off Silas. The auctioneer hesitated, looking between the agent, the mysterious man, and the two giants. The air was thick with the scent of impending conflict. Elara felt a tremor in her hands. Who was this man? And why did he step in? The core loop of her past, the debt, the betrayal, with the men who had shackled her, was beginning to weave its way into the present. The auctioneer raised the gavel. 125. Do I hear more? The agent turned to look at Silas. His eyes filled with a dark, terrifying promise. He didn't bid again. But as he retreated, he leaned close enough to Elara for her to smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "You are not going to survive the week," he hissed. As the gavel fell, the crowd broke into a confused roar. But Silas and Elara stood in the center of the chaos, the victory tasting like ash in their mouths. They had kept the land, but the true threat had only just begun to show its face. Who was the stranger? And what did he want in exchange for his help? The town square felt like a tightening noose. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wood, with a finality that seemed to echo through the valley. Yet there was no celebration in the victory. The mysterious man who had placed the final bid walked toward them, his boots thumping dully on the wooden planks. He was older, his face a map of hard-won experience, and, when he reached them, he did not look at Elara. He looked only at Silas, a deep, silent recognition passing between them that suggested a history far older than the mountain pass. "You should have left." "Silas," the man said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. Silas remained motionless, his massive frame shielding Elara. "I do not leave what is mine to protect." The man nodded, almost sadly. "The agent is not acting alone. He is the vanguard of a syndicate that buys up the pass to control the timber rights. They do not care about the land, they care about the profit. And they do not like losing." Elara felt the weight of Silas's hand on her shoulder, heavy, firm, and grounding. But she also saw the way his fingers twitched near his belt. The instinctual reaction of a man who had survived by the strength of his own steel. The jealousy she had felt simmering in the crowd now ignited into something more dangerous, a protective, possessive fire. The land agent was still hovering at the edge of the square, watching them with eyes that looked less like a businessman's and more like a scavenger's. "Who are you?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "A name does not matter," the stranger replied, turning away as if his task were already complete. "But the debt you owe now is not in silver. It is in the trouble you have just invited upon this mountain. Keep your eyes on the trails." He walked away, disappearing into the crowded street before they could demand more. Silas stood for a long moment, watching the space where the man had stood. Then, he turned to Elara, his eyes dark with an emotion she hadn't seen there before, an intense, consuming fervor. He grabbed the reins of the draft horse and pulled the wagon toward the edge of town. His movements hurried, almost desperate. They made the journey back up the mountain in silence. But it was not the peaceful silence of their previous trips. It was a silence charged with a frantic, pulsing energy. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig, seemed to Silas like a threat. He was a man who had built his life around the concept of isolation. And now, for the first time, the walls he had built were not strong enough. When they reached the homestead, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. Silas did not stop to unload the wagon. He went straight to the barn, his movements jagged. Elara followed him, the cold biting at her cheeks. "Why are you so angry?" she asked, stopping in the barn doorway. Silas spun around, his massive frame dwarfing the hay bales behind him. He looked at her, his chest heaving. "I am not angry at you. I am angry at the world that thinks it can stake a claim on your life." He paced the small space, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight. "The agent, the way he looked at you. It was not just about the money. He wants to own you, Elara. He wants to put you back in the chains." Elara stepped into the barn, closing the distance between them until she was within his reach. She saw the raw, exposed nerves in his expression. It wasn't just protective instinct, it was a deep, terrifying dependence. He was a man who had lost his entire world once, and he was terrified that the universe was lining up to take everything from him again. "He cannot have me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense hum. "You saw me back there. I did not shrink. I did not run." Silas reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he dropped it, as if afraid to touch her. "That is the problem. You are too brave for your own good. You make it impossible for me to stay in the shadows." "I do not want you in the shadows," she countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He looked at her, and the fire in his eyes softened, replaced by a yearning so sharp it was almost painful. He stepped into her space, his massive body casting her into shadow. He was so close that she could smell the cold air and wood smoke clinging to him. The proximity was intoxicating, a physical demand that made her knees feel weak. "I have spent years keeping my heart in a locked room," he whispered, his voice vibrating in his chest. "I thought if I didn't care about anything, I couldn't be hurt. Das. But every time that man looks at you, I feel like I am losing my mind. I feel a rage that is not mine, it is deeper. Older." Elara realized then that he was speaking of love. A love he had never learned how to name. A love that frightened him more than the freezing winters or the armed men in the valley. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, his beard rough against her skin. He leaned into the touch, a low sound escaping his throat. "Silas," she breathed. He caught her hand, pressing it against his neck. The power in his body was immense. Yet, he was careful, as if she were made of the most delicate glass. "If he comes back," he said, his voice tight, "I will not let him near you. I will burn this mountain to the ground before I let them touch you again." "And what of you?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Will you stay by my side? Or will you use your strength to push me away, to keep me safe?" He froze. It was the question he had been avoiding since the day he found her in the ruins. He had been so focused on protecting her that he had forgotten the necessity of belonging. He looked at her, really looked at her, the strength in her gaze, the resilience of her spirit, and realized that she was not a burden to be shielded. She was his equal. He pulled her closer, his massive hands spanning her waist, lifting her until their eyes were level. The distance between them vanished. The vulnerability, the jealousy, worse, the fear, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. But as he leaned in, a distant sound shattered the moment. A horse or several was moving up the pass. The rhythm was fast, and entirely out of place for this late hour. Silas set her down gently, his face shifting instantly from lover to warrior. He moved to the door of the barn, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch of his rifle. "They are here," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers with a cold, terrifying intensity. "They are not waiting for the week to pass." The sanctuary was no longer enough. The battle had arrived. The sound of the approaching horses was a rhythmic, hammering percussion against the frozen earth, growing steadily louder in the biting night air. Silas stepped out of the barn, his massive silhouette framed against the moonlight. He moved with a heavy, lethal grace, his hand clamped firmly around the warm barrel of his rifle. Elara did not stay behind. She followed him into the yard, her own muscles coiled, her breath pluming in the frigid air like dragonfire. She felt the heavy, pulsating rhythm of her heart, matching the frantic tempo of the riders drawing closer. They reached the edge of the clearing, just as the shadows of the riders broke through the tree line. There were 4 of them, hunched over their saddles, their faces masked by low-pulled hats. They did not slow down as they entered the property, their horses lathered and panting. The leader pulled his mount to a skidding halt, the horse's front hooves kicking up a spray of ice and dirt. "Silas," the leader called out, his voice a sneering, thin melody. "We heard you made a purchase today. We were wondering if you had the courtesy to share your new property with the rest of us." Silas did not lower his rifle. He stood like a monolith, his voice cutting through the wind. "You are trespassing. The deed is secured. Turn your horses around and leave this pass, or you will not leave at all." The men laughed. A hollow, discordant sound. The leader dismounted, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen ground. He was smaller than Silas, but he moved with a practiced, predatory ease. "The deed is paper. Giant. Paper burns. And you have spent too many years talking to the trees. You have forgotten how the world works." Elara stepped forward, placing herself beside Silas. The light from the moon hit her face, illuminating the fierce, unyielding resolve in her eyes. The leader's stopped, his gaze darting to her, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face. He had expected a cowering runaway. He found a woman who stood with the same imposing, terrifying gravity as the man beside her. "She is not a thing to be claimed," Elara said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath them. "I belong to no one, and I will not be moved." The leader sneered, reaching toward his waistband. In an instant, the world shifted into slow motion. Silas moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk. He covered the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand snapping out to intercept the man's movement. He slammed the man against the side of the wagon, the impact sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. "Do not," Silas warned, his voice a low growl that seemed to emerge from the very depths of his chest. The other 3 men shifted, hands going to their holsters, but they hesitated. They looked at the massive, scarred mountain man and then at the giantess standing behind him, her posture ready for violence. The 2 of them were a singular, synchronized force, a pair of guardians whose sheer physical presence was a deterrent to any rational mind. "We were just asking," the leader wheezed, struggling for air under the giant's massive grip. "You were asking for your death," Silas replied, his voice devoid of any mercy. He shoved the man away, sending him sprawling into the snow. "Tell your employers that the land is occupied. If you return, I will not bother with warnings." The men retreated in a flurry of chaos, scrambling back onto their horses. They galloped off into the darkness, their threats fading into the howling wind. But the peace did not return to the yard. The adrenaline was still surging through them, a raw, electric current that made the air feel thin and sharp. Silas turned to Elara. His chest was heaving, his face a mask of primal, protective fury. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, though he was entirely unaware of it. "They will come back," he muttered, his eyes searching hers. "They will bring more men. They will bring tools to tear this place down. Then we will hold the line," Elara replied, her voice unshaken. Silas looked at her, and the anger in his expression broke, replaced by a devastating, raw realization. He pulled her into his arms, his massive frame folding around her like a blanket. He held her with such intensity that she could feel the pulse in his neck, the frantic, irregular rhythm of a man who was finally, completely, terrifyingly in love. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his voice a ragged whisper. I have spent so long fearing the loss of my peace that I almost missed the point of living. I would rather die defending this life with you than survive 1,000 years in that silence. Elara felt the tears prick her eyes. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip the back of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the earth. The intimacy of the moment was a physical weight, a surrender to the fact that they were no longer two separate, wounded survivors. They were a singular entity, built to withstand the freezing cold and the cruel world. They moved toward the house, their shoulders touching, their stride perfectly aligned. The barn was no longer a place for Silas to hide. The parlor was no longer a place for Elara to endure. They entered the home, and for the first time, Silas locked the door, not against the world, but to seal themselves into the sanctuary they had built. They stood in the center of the room, the dying firelight casting long, flickering shadows. There was no more silence to be filled. There was only the quiet, heavy understanding of what lay ahead. They had kept the land. They had faced the threat, and they had found each other. But as they stood in the warmth of the hearth, Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She looked at the box on the mantel, the box with the tiny shoe. She realized that while she had shared the story of her debt, there was still a part of her heart she had guarded, a part that feared if she truly confessed her love, she would lose the only person who had ever truly seen her. She turned to look at Silas, his eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful devotion. She knew she had to speak, to bridge the final gap between them, or the uncertainty would destroy them from within. Silas, she began, her voice trembling. There is something else. Something about the man who bid on the land, the man who helped us. Silas paused, his expression shifting to one of intense, piercing focus. What do you mean? He is not a stranger, she whispered, the realization finally falling into place. He is the only man who knows the truth about my father. And if he has found me here, it means he has finally decided what price he intends to collect. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the stillness before a mountain avalanche. Silas stood frozen, his massive hands still resting on her shoulders, the warmth of his touch now replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. The man who had bid on the land, the weathered, gray-haired soldier, was not a savior. He was a link to the life Elara had fought with every ounce of her strength to outrun. The man in town, Silas began, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He knew you. Elara stepped back, her movements sluggish, as if she were wading through deep water. She paced the small length of the parlor, her eyes fixed on the floor. He is not a stranger. Silas. He was my father's friend, or so he claimed. He was the one who managed the books for the lumber baron. He knows the truth. He knows my father was innocent. He has watched me for years, waiting for the right moment to use that knowledge against me. Why now? Silas asked, his face darkening with a protective, fierce rage. Why would he come to this mountain? Because of the debt, Elara whispered, the realization finally finding its bitter shape. They did not just want labor. They wanted the land the mill sat on, the land my father had homesteaded before they took everything. They could not find the deed, and they thought I knew where it was hidden. They were waiting to see if I would lead them to it. She looked up at Silas, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of profound betrayal and fear. He didn't bid on the land to save us, Silas. He bid on it to keep the agent from taking it, so he could come here himself and extract what he is looking for. Silas felt a cold, jagged ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the freezing mountain air. The sanctity of the home they had built. The fragile trust they had woven into the fabric of their daily survival. It all felt exposed. Vulnerable to the machinations of a man who dealt in human lives like commodities. "He will come here," Silas stated, his grip on his rifle tightening until his knuckles turned ivory. "He will come to this house, and he will demand what he thinks belongs to him. And when he does," Elara said, her voice turning hard, "he will not stop until he finds it. If I stay, he will burn this mountain to the ground. Silas. He will destroy everything you have rebuilt. The house, the barn, the peace you have finally started to taste again." She walked toward him, her towering frame moving with a desperate, heartbreaking grace. She reached out, placing her hand over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful thud beneath the wool of his shirt. "I have to leave. I have to draw him away from here. If I lead him toward the northern rail line, he will follow me, thinking I am going to the treasure he seeks." "No," Silas growled. The word ripped from his throat. "I will not let you walk back into that fire. We are stronger together. We will face him here, and we will hold this ground." "You cannot hold the ground against the man who holds the law," Elara argued, her voice rising. "He has the paperwork, Silas. He has the influence. If you fight him here, you are a mountain man attacking a pillar of the community. They will hang you for it. I will not have your blood on my hands. I have seen enough blood spilled over greed to last a lifetime." She saw the internal conflict raging behind his eyes, the stoic protector clashing with the man who had finally opened his heart to a partner. He looked at her, searching for a flaw in her logic, a crack in her resolve. But she was resolute. She had been forged in the crucible of loss. She knew the cost of staying. And she knew the price of going. "I have already packed a bag," she admitted softly. The confession, a physical weight that made her slump. "I am leaving before the dawn." Silas moved then, not to restrain her, but to pull her into an embrace so tight it felt as if he were trying to fuse their very souls together. He buried his face in her hair, his frame shaking with a silent, devastating grief. He was a man of the mountain, a man who believed in the immutability of the stone. But he was realizing that the world was constantly in motion, and it was demanding a toll he was not prepared to pay. "You are my heart," he murmured, the words so soft she almost missed them. "I thought I knew what it was to lose everything when my son passed. But this is a different kind of ending." Elara leaned into him, her heart shattering in slow motion. She felt the strength in his arms, the grounding, solid presence that had become the defining map of her world. "It is not an ending, Silas. It is a sacrifice. I am protecting the only thing I have ever loved." They stayed like that for hours, the fire dying down to a mere flicker of orange in the dark. The house, which had felt like a fortress only hours before, now felt like a tomb. The air was heavy with the things left unsaid, with the promises that would never be kept, and with the brutal, inevitable approach of the morning. When the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the walls, Elara pulled away. She had her rucksack slung over her broad shoulder. She did not look back, because she knew that if she saw the pain in his eyes, the resolve that had held her steady would liquefy into despair. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the latch. Silas stood in the center of the room, his form massive and shadowed, a sentinel who had been stripped of his charge. "Silas," she whispered, not turning. "Keep the box on the mantel." Do not let the cold take the memory. I will be waiting, he replied, his voice devoid of its usual weight, sounding strangely hollow. I will be here when you return. She opened the door and stepped out into the biting morning air. The mountain was silence, the snow untouched, the world waiting for her next move. She began the descent, her footprints marking the beginning of her journey back into the shadow of her past. Behind her, Silas stood in the doorway, his massive hand clutching the frame so tightly the wood creaked in protest. He watched her until she was nothing more than a speck against the vast, white canvas of the peaks. He felt a hollowness in his chest that felt as deep as the mountain pass itself. He was a protector who had failed to protect the one thing that truly mattered. And now, he had to decide if he would remain the stoic giant, fading into the history of the mountain, or if he would finally break the cycle of loss and reclaim the woman who had taught him how to live. The path ahead was long, and in the distance, the sound of a rider was already beginning to drift upward, carried by the cold wind. The trek down the mountain was a brutal, unrelenting march. Elara's body, hardened by years of forced labor, pushed through the freezing drifts, but her spirit felt fractured. Every step away from the homestead was a step away from the only warmth she had ever known. She moved toward the distant rail line, a thin iron ribbon cutting through the vast, indifferent wilderness. She knew the man who had bid on the land, the man who claimed to be her father's friend, would be following the trail. He was a patient predator, and he would not stop until he believed he had recovered the debt he felt the world owed him. As the sun reached its peak, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley floor, the sound of a horse drew near. It was not the frantic pace of the previous night's intruders. This was a steady, measured trot. Elara stopped, her hand dropping to the heavy, blunt tool she carried in her pack, though she knew it would be useless against a man who held the authority of the law in his coat pocket. She turned to see the gray-haired stranger riding toward her. He pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes tracking her with a clinical, detached precision. You are a long way from the cabin, Elara, the man said, his voice stripped of the faux kindness he had displayed in town. I am going, she replied, her voice steady. I am leaving the valley. The land is yours. Take it. Leave the mountain man alone. The man leaned forward, a grim smile touching his lips. You do not understand the nature of the transaction. The land is worthless without the secret buried on it. Your father was a simple man, but he was not stupid. He left something behind, the records, the proof that the mill fire was arson. It is the only thing that stands between my employers and a ruinous court case. He dismounted, walking slowly toward her. Come with me, quietly, and I will ensure that the giant you are protecting stays unmolested. Refuse, and I will see to it that he is charged with kidnapping, arson, and trespassing. I have the law at my back. Elara. You have nothing. Elara felt the cold seep into her bones. He was right. He had the power of the state, and she was merely an escaped woman with a target on her back. She prepared to surrender, to walk into the trap to save Silas, when the air behind her suddenly seemed to shift. The sound was not a shout. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding of boots on the snow, moving with the speed of an avalanche. Elara spun around. Silas was there. He had not stayed in the cabin. He had tracked her, his massive frame cutting through the snow with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. He looked wild, his beard matted with ice, his eyes burning with a dark, primordial fury. He stood between Elara and the stranger, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. "You speak of law," Silas said, his voice a low, grinding growl that made the horses shy away in terror. "But you stand on my mountain. And on this mountain, the law is written in the stone." The stranger reached for his holster, but Silas was faster. In one fluid, brutal motion, Silas grabbed the man by the wrist, the sound of the man's gasp echoing through the pass. He disarmed him in a blink, throwing the pistol into the deep snow. "I am a man who has lost everything," Silas continued, stepping into the man's space, towering over him until the stranger looked like a child. "I have buried my son, and I have buried my hope. Do you think I fear your courts? Do you think I fear your employers?" Silas reached into his vest, pulling out a heavy, folded packet of papers, the deed, along with a stack of old, yellowed ledgers he had discovered beneath the floorboards of the hearth only that morning. He shoved them into the man's chest. "These are the records you seek," Silas said. "They are the proof of your guilt, not my father's. They are copies, but they are enough to see you hang." The stranger's face paled, his arrogance dissolving into pure, unadulterated fear. "You would ruin yourself to destroy me." "I am already ruined," Silas replied, his voice devoid of all doubt. "I have found something worth more than my life, and I am willing to pay the price to ensure she remains free." He turned to Elara, his eyes softening as they locked onto hers. The transition was breathtaking. From the weaponized protector to the man who loved her with a depth that transcended all logic. "Go," he whispered. "Take the horses. Take the deed. If you stay, they will hunt us both. If you leave, I will hold the line. I will face them." "No," Elara cried, stepping forward. "I will not leave you to face them alone." "You are not leaving me," he said, reaching out to cup her face with his massive, calloused hands. "You are buying us a future. I have the evidence. I will turn myself in. I will testify. And I will end this. You will be free of the debt. And you will be free of the past." The weight of his sacrifice hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was offering his own freedom to secure hers. He was trading his life, the only life he had, to ensure that the stain of the past could no longer touch her. The stranger began to scramble toward his horse, eyes darting between the giants, realizing he had lost the leverage he had spent years crafting. He fled into the woods, knowing he could not win against a man who had already decided that death was a small price to pay. Elara grabbed Silas's arm, her strength matching his. "If you do this, they will take you. They will put you in a cage. Do you think I can live with that?" Silas smiled, a small, broken, beautiful smile. "I have lived in a cage of my own making for 10 years. Elara. I was the jailer and the prisoner. But you showed me that the cage door was never locked. If I go to them, I do it as a free man, because for the first time in my life, I have made a choice for someone other than myself." The sound of more riders approached, not the stranger's men, but the town sheriff's posse, drawn by the commotion. The game was up. Silas pushed Elara toward the horse, his gaze lingering on her one last time, a look of profound, eternal devotion. "Run," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion. "Run to the horizon, and do not look back until you are safe." As she mounted the horse, she felt the world splintering. The core loop, the mystery of her identity and the debt that had followed her. was being resolved by a man who had decided that her freedom was worth more than his own existence. She turned the horse, tears blinding her, as Silas stepped into the path of the approaching lawman, his massive frame standing as a final, immovable barrier between her and the end. The winter air bit at Elara's skin as she galloped away, but the cold did not reach her heart. She held the heavy packet of papers, the ledger of truths that would shatter the syndicate's hold, pressed tightly against her chest. She rode for hours, putting miles between herself and the mountains. Yet her mind remained anchored to the narrow pass where Silas stood. The resolution did not come with fire or swords. It came in the quiet, sterile halls of the county courthouse. Because Silas had surrendered with the evidence in hand, the investigation became a public spectacle the syndicate could not bury. The papers Elara had carried revealed decades of arson, coercion, and fraudulent land claims. The judge, a man who feared the scrutiny of the state more than the influence of a local gang, acted with a swiftness that shocked the valley. The syndicate fell, but Silas remained. He was held for questioning, then for trial, his massive frame a silent, stoic presence in the small, cramped courtroom. Elara did not hide. She arrived at the courthouse on the final day, walking through the front doors with her head held high. When the verdict was read, exoneration for the mountain man, and the total dismantling of the syndicate's reach, the silence in the room was absolute. Silas stood, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto hers. In that gaze, she saw the culmination of their journey, the release of his grief, the validation of her worth, and the birth of a future that belonged to neither the mountain nor the valley, but to them. 2 months later, the spring thaw began to tear the snow from the peaks. The homestead was quiet, but the air was filled with the promise of growth. The repairs they had made together held strong against the retreating winter. Silas stood on the porch, his massive hands resting on the railing, watching the valley below. The silence of the mountain was no longer a tomb, it was a sanctuary. He heard the soft, rhythmic sound of boots on the path. He did not turn around, for he knew the stride. Elara approached, stepping onto the porch beside him. She looked at the view, the vast, sprawling green of the forest, the jagged teeth of the peaks reaching for the sky. She reached out, her fingers finding his, the silver band on his thumb brushing against her skin. "It is over," she said, her voice a soft, steady hum. Silas looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes was still there. But the jagged edges of his pain had been smoothed away by time and the presence of the woman beside him. He took her hand, turning his body to face her. "Nothing is ever truly over, Elara. But for the first time, I am not afraid of what the seasons will bring." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that felt like safety. The fear of loss had once dictated every beat of his heart. Now, it was replaced by the terrifying, beautiful realization that he had everything he had ever needed. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I thought I was waiting for you to return," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I realized, while I was waiting, that you never really left. You were with me in every log I split, in every fire I built. You became the hearth." Elara felt the tears fall, but they were tears of profound, earned catharsis. She reached up, cupping his face, her hands feeling the strength of his jaw, the reality of his presence. "We are both home, Silas. We are not hiding anymore." They stood there as the sun set, the golden light turning the world into a canvas of infinite possibility. The debt was paid. The past was interred in the cold earth. And the giants, who had once been defined by their size, their isolation, and their wounds, were now defined by the simple, radical act of loving one another. They were no longer anomalies. They were a foundation. In the end, the giant mountain man and the giant woman did not need the world to validate them. They had built a world of their own, one where dignity was not earned through service, but granted through the simple, unwavering presence of a partner who understood the weight of the mountain and chose to carry it anyway. The story of their union became a legend in the valley, a quiet campfire memory told to those who had lost their way. It was a story not of strength or physical power, but of the way two broken souls could find the courage to be vulnerable, and, in that vulnerability, find the only thing that truly matters, a place to belong. This story is a work of historical romance fiction. All characters, locations, and events are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events or locales is entirely coincidental. The themes of emotional healing and resilience are intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, and do not constitute professional advice.